All right. In the previous video, we already introduced the concept of twin deficits, right? We said that trade deficit and budget deficit are positively correlated, okay, based upon our math derivation from the national income account identity. Okay, of course, this is an economy in the open. It's open to the rest of the world. Okay, all right. So here we're gonna check out the empirical evidence about the twin deficit. Okay, if that's a theoretical hypothesis, we got to get it tested. We got to see if it's consistent with the real world data, right? And here, what I'm showing you. This is a figure I got from the Congressional Budget Office, CBO, and this is one of their recent reports. Okay, and it shows their projection about the future government revenues and outlays. That simply means the government spending. Okay, the money flowing out of the government. So everything is expressed as a percentage of GDP, and here we want to drive your attention to a specific historical period, during the Ronald Reagan as the U.S. president. Okay, in other words, we're looking at here from 1981 to 1989. Okay, these 8 years under the Reagan administration. Okay, now once again, this figure shows the dark one, like blue or red one is the government outlays. In other words, the government expenditure. The light blue, the light green one is the revenue. Okay, the tax. Dollars flowing into the government offices. So during this period, this historical period, you find that in the first 2 years, okay, 2 or 3 years, the government revenues declined substantially. Okay, several percentage points in GDP. This is because Ronald Reagan and his administration believed this so-called the supply side economics. In other words, they strongly advocates for tax cuts. Okay, they actually cut the federal income taxes and the corporate taxes, especially the capital gain tax. Okay, so that's why the government revenue as the share in GDP decreased a lot. Okay. At the same time, the Reagan administration raised the government spending, okay, especially in the national defense spending, because they believe that's the right action to take when the United States was faced the challenges from the Soviet Union. And now, because of that, you could imagine here the gap between the two curves would be the budget deficit, right? Because the darker one at the on the bottom, that's the government spending, and the lighter one at the bottom, that's the revenue, right? So the wider the gap between these two curves, the larger the government budget deficit. Okay, so as you can see, the first few years during the Reagan administration, the budget deficit increased a lot. Okay, now after the first few years, then the revenue becomes stable, and then the government spending gets smaller. Okay, so the gap becomes smaller. All right. Now, based upon the twin deficit hypothesis, we would expect the current account deficit or trade deficit would become larger during this period, okay? At least for the first few years, and then it might decline in the last few years during his administration. Now let's check this out. Here, this chart again show you two deficits. So the first one, the light blue one, it's a current account as a percentage of GDP. So this is the trade deficit. Okay, and because it stays below zero line, so it's a deficit instead of surplus. Okay. Now the dark blue one is a federal deficit. Okay, as a percentage in GDP. Okay. And as you can see, for most of the time, in recent decades, you find that the U.S. federal government run budget deficit. Okay, except for these few years during the Clinton administration. Now, once again, we are narrowly focusing upon this period, these 8 years from 1981 to 1989. Okay, and as we already observed from the previous chart, the government budget deficit increased a lot in the first few years, and then stay relatively stable for another 2 or 3 years, and finally it decreased. Okay, the deficit. So here, because it's negative, so this increase here, it actually shows a smaller government budget deficit. And when you look at the lighter, like the blue one, which stands for trade deficit, again, in the first few years, the trade deficit was almost zero. Okay, you can barely see it here at the edge. But, since 1982-83, then it significantly increased, along with the government budget deficit, right? And then in late 1980s, when government budget deficit declined, so did the current account deficit, in other words, the trade deficit. So this is a piece of evidence, supporting the twin deficit hypothesis. Okay. Now, here I would like to go back to the previous CBO CBO chart. Okay, to show the total revenue and the expenditure or outlays of the government. But this time, I want to focus upon, the years to come. Okay, in other words, not historical period, but the projections here. Okay. Now, I want to raise this question: what will happen to the trade deficit of the United States in the near future? Okay, based upon what you see here about the government revenue and outlays. Okay, now bring your thoughts to class, and we can discuss these. Okay. All right. We just checked out a piece of evidence which supports the twin deficit hypothesis. But we would also find some counter evidence. Okay, in other words, we find it's not always true. It's not always consistent with the real world data. Okay, so here what we're gonna talk about is the European Union members' efforts to cut their government spending before 1999. Okay. Why 1999? Because that's the deadline, that's the year right before the establishment of the European Union. Okay. Now, EU requires its member economy to cut its government spending, so they have the limit for these member economies. They do not allow the member economies to run a huge government deficit. Okay. Budget deficit. Their concern would be, if a European economy has a huge amount of the government deficit, then later that economy could get in trouble. Okay, and with the establishment of the European Union, they, to some extent, it becomes one economy, right? Because they have the common market, right? So they probably need to bail that economy out, and that's the situation they are trying to avoid here. Okay. All right. So let's check out what actually happened here among these among the EU economies. Now here we're showing you from 1995 to 1999, these 5 years. Let's look at the very last column, G minus T. So that's a government budget deficit, right? As you can see that, because, these minus just means it's a deficit, right? And I guess here they probably should say T minus G, right? Because it's minus. Yeah, it should be T minus G. I'm sorry about that. And you do find that budget deficit decreased a lot because, again, these member economies were required to do so. Okay, so they did it. Okay, they lowered significantly their budget deficit. So if the twin deficit were true, okay, or the hypothesis were true, then we would expect that the current account deficit would also decrease, right? But look at this. The current account, again, it actually increased in the first 2 years and then decreased. Okay, when we compare, 1999 with the 1995, we did not really see much difference between these 2 years. Okay, in other words, we didn't see a positive correlation between the budget deficit and trade deficit with these EU member economies. Okay. Now, what happened here? That's why here we put the private saving and investment, in the table as well. Now, as you can see, the investment stays almost the same, right? It increased, but less than 1 percentage point of their gross national product, right? From 19.9 to 20.8%, almost the same, right? The interesting thing happened here. The private saving actually decreased a lot from 25.9% all the way down to 21.8%. In other words, 4.1 percentage points decrease, which is similar to the decrease in budget deficit here. In other words, what we're trying to say is the private saving fell significantly during the same period. Okay? Now, how could we make sense of this? Why the private saving responded to the decline in government budget deficit, right? Now, here we're going to introduce an economic concept called Ricardian equivalence, and we're going to talk about it in for an open economy, right? So what is a Ricardian equivalence? Obviously, this is named after the very famous economist David Ricardo, right? Ricardian equivalence says that, the private sector, households, and businesses will respond to the government fiscal policies. So in this case, we find the government or the governments in the member economies, they were committed to reduce their budget deficit, right? So the Ricardian equivalence would say that the private sector here, specifically the households, would predict or expect that because the government budget deficit declines, so in the future, they probably could pay less taxes, okay? In other words, they don't need to pay extra taxes to finance the government budget deficit in the future, okay? Like after they join the EU. And because of that, they feel like they have less burden on their shoulder. So they tend to spend more, they tend to consume more. That's why their private saving declines, okay? Simply speaking, we're saying that households respond to fiscal policies. And of course, this could be true the other way around. So when government increases budget deficit, then the private sector may cut their spending save the money for the future tax